Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Hamilton. I direct the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center. And we have a special event today. It's a farewell, it's hard to even say those words really, for the head of the Wilson Center, Congresswoman Jane Harman, and who's leaving the Wilson Center at the end of this month after a brilliant reign. And a number of the programs at the Wilson Center have been doing these type of farewell events, and now we're turning to Europe and to relations between Europe and the United States. And we have a stellar group here, including Congresswoman Harman. We're proud today to also co-sponsor this event with the Munich Security Conference. The chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Wolfgang Ischinger, is here with us, together with our Global Europe chair, Baroness Catherine Ashton. So quite a group. We look forward to discussing prospects for transatlantic relations going forward. And we said, we'd like to sort of sketch out the next decade of the relationship, but of course you have to get through the next week of the relationship before you can do that. And the next few days are going to be quite striking for this relationship, because Wolfgang Ischinger is hosting the leaders of the major countries involved in this relationship on Friday. Not only President Biden and Chancellor Merkel, but I understand now President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson, together with Ursula von der Leyen, Secretary General of the UN. Wolfgang is quite a lineup. So we anticipate that, of course. Since you are the host of that, and you have a chance to host those individuals, if you did have a chance of giving them advice on what they should say on Friday, this relationship, what would you tell them?
Thank you so much, Dan. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be with Cathy Ashton and with you and the others, honoring my wonderful friend Jane. And so before I try to respond to your question, let me say a word about Jane Harman. As far as I'm concerned, Jane Harman has now been, for a decade or more, the director and chairperson, etc., of the Wilson Center. I cannot imagine, having worked there for a bit, actually, on a sabbatical in 2014, I cannot imagine the Wilson Center without Jane Harman. For me, the Wilson Center was and still is and will be Jane Harman. The same goes to cover the other end of the transatlantic relationship. The same goes for the Munich Security Conference. I cannot imagine, and I'm sure that Jane will be willing to accept our invitations also in the future, because I cannot imagine a Munich Security Conference without Jane. In fact, one part of the proceedings in Munich, a concluding dinner, which I have traditionally been hosting for the last long number of years, is informally being called the Jane Harman Dinner, honoring one of our most loyal, most effective and strongest supporters, not only of the event of the Munich Security Conference, but of a trustful transatlantic relationship. So Jane, my heart goes out to you. You've been such a wonderful friend over so many years, for me, for many of my associates, my friends in German diplomacy, in German politics, and actually throughout Europe. It has been just a great experience to work with you, to laugh with you, and to have a good time, even as our countries sometimes go through some kinds of crisis situations. So now let me let me try to answer your question, Dan. What would be the best advice or the best hope I could express when these leaders, beginning with the President of the United States, the Chancellor of Germany, President of France, Prime Minister Johnson of the UK, when they address our audience, virtually, of course, this coming Friday? Well, I would say, addressing myself to my European friends, let's not wait for President Biden to bring us the goodies now. Let's not believe that after I'm a diplomat, after 4 difficult years, I could use a stronger term, after 4 difficult years, let's not believe that he can and will now make everything right again. Instead, I would sort of base my advice on this old well-known quote from John F. Kennedy. In other words, let's not wait for Joe Biden to make things right. Let us be proactive and engage with the United States. Let's not ask what the US will want to do about us in Europe and about the relationship. Let's ask ourselves what we can and what we should do in our own interest for the future of this relationship, which is so vitally important for us. Dan, I know I've already used up my time, so back to you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. You are diplomatic because we'll have to ask you at a certain point, what do you mean by that? What is Europe prepared to do, really? That's the tough question. And is there a Europe that can be called a Europe in terms of those types of issues? But let me turn to Kathy Ashton. Kathy, before I do that, let me tell our audience how they can join in and participate. We have a way for audience comment and question. You send it in either via email or send us a tweet. So if you can send it to email, it's GEP, Global Europe Program, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a tweet at Wilson Center GEP. As you send those in, we'll turn to audience questions and weave those in as we go forward. So Kathy Ashton, Wolfgang has sort of said the Europeans need to come and explain what they want to do and just have an agenda for the United States. You wrote an article that's in the current Wilson Quarterly magazine, and the title was the title also of our talk today, Transatlantic Tranquility, but with a question mark. And I wonder, do you foresee, especially given the position the UK now has with other parts of Europe, a united sort of way of talking to the Americans? Are there priority issues that really need to be addressed first? How do you see this?
Thank you, Dan. It's wonderful to be here. It's always a joy to be with Wolfgang, but it's an especial moment in our history together to be here with Jane in one of the many, and rightly many, farewell events for her. If I look at Wolfgang and Jane, Dan, this is the transatlantic relationship. Through thick and thin, through bad times and good, the Munich Security Conference has been the centerpiece of how that relationship translates. And Jane has been one of the strongest vocal advocates for both the Munich Security Conference, but also for the general principle that our values and ideals hold us together across the Atlantic. And for that alone, she deserves the accolades and the thanks of everyone. Above and beyond that, of course, over 10 years as president, director, CEO, a whole plethora of titles, Jane, but essentially the person who is the guardian of the Wilson Center brand and the proponent of Wilson everywhere in the world. And I came to it through you, and it's been an amazing experience for me, as it is for everybody who gets involved. It will not be the same that's for sure. But as Wolfgang has rightly said, you will continue, whatever you do next, being part of the strong, dynamic relationship, the thread, if you like, that spans across the Atlantic. And for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, because it's so important. In terms of what Wolfgang will be doing later this week, it's a really important moment as we grapple with how to move forward in these relationships that have been battered and bruised in recent times. The UK relationship with the EU, the American relationship with Europe has gone through some unprecedented, I think, certainly in my lifetime, turbulence. And it is an opportunity, starting this week, to really start to think about what I would describe as a three-legged stool. It's, for me, and I'm doing this from, obviously, from a British perspective, I'm sitting here in London, it's the UK, US, EU. There is, on several issues, a real need, in my personal opinion, to bring together the EU and the UK to collaborate on areas of policy where they have everything in common. And the transatlantic relationship for Europe as a continent, which includes the UK, is absolutely vital to the future. In a post-COVID world, that will be even more so. Dan, you mentioned that I'd written something, and I raised 3 or 4 areas where I think that's particularly true. Clearly, the combination of work being done as we head towards November and the big conference in Scotland on climate change, the appointment of former Secretary Kerry to lead that for the United States, the strength of the Green Deal proposals and ideas coming out of the European Commission and the European Union, and of course, Britain as host. It's a good example of pulling together to do something that's going to be incredibly important. I would say the most important subject that we will tackle in the next few years. On top of that, the relationship with China. Still lots to be done to think about where we go, how that important relationship is going to be developed. On the one hand, significant concerns, both economically and politically. On the other hand, significant ways of working together that we've seen economically and politically. And I think it's going to be really important to try and find a collaborative approach to that. And of course, broader than that, on the whole questions of defence and security, the review that NATO has completed and produced talks a lot about business as usual, that the core objectives and aims of NATO remain, but also is looking to the future, both in terms of that relationship with China, but also reflecting on what further needs to be thought about in the context of Russia. And new threats, cybersecurity being perhaps the most obvious one. And the final one that I would always mention, of course, is what now on Iran and the future of the JCPOA, where the E3, Britain, France and Germany, significant and important part of that process, together with the United States, together with the European Union, but also in the context of the P5+1, together with Russia and China, now need to contemplate what they're going to do, whether they're going to push forward back into that agreement, produce a set of different agreements, move into a mini version, a JPOA rather than a JCPOA, take the comprehensive word out, or how they're going to try and work with countries in the region with deep concerns about Iran. All of those issues seem to me just some examples of the collaboration between obvious partners, whether they're individual countries, as Britain is in this context, whether they're 27 countries collaborating together, and whether it's the strength of the United States. This is a real moment. And Wolfgang, I think, will have the opening of this, the Munich Security Conference.
Thank you, Kathy. So Jane, It's so great to see you and to have you join here with us on this event for you, honoring you. But knowing you, it's also about talking about the substance of the relationship. And we would be in Munich, you know, if the pandemic wouldn't have stopped us. But if we think also to the next few days, the messages that will be coming out, Wolfgang said, you know, Europe should be proactive. What do you think the Biden administration now, and also if you could add, because it's so important, the perspective, what's American expectation of Europe these days for the partnership going forward? What does the United States actually expect of Europe? Kathy mentioned 4 really important issues, and maybe there are some others. I know there are big consideration with the defense minister meeting at NATO about Afghanistan and our future there. But the mood here in Washington, as we've gone through some turbulence ourselves and now turn attention to Europe, what's America's expectation of our European partners and allies?
Well, thank you, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon to dearest friends. They know this. You've heard me, Dan, particularly talk about the Wilson family. I always do that. It is a family, and Team Wilson has achieved miraculous things over the decade that I've been there. You know, I'm cheerleader and a family member, but it's a team that has accomplished our rating as the number one in the world, as number 1 in the world for regional expertise. That's our substantive programs. And oh, by the way, the Munich Security Conference is back at number 1 in the world for a conference. So bravo, Wolfgang. But I talk about the Wilson family. There also is, in addition to the Wilson family, which all of you are part of, there's my personal family, my heart, which has a lot of people in it, you know, 4 children, 4 stepchildren, 525 grandchildren. That's not fair, but you know, a lot of people. But it has additional sisters and brothers and daughters and sons. And 2 of my additional siblings are on this call. One of them is Wolfgang and the other one is Kathy. And an additional daughter is not on this call. Wolfgang is laughing, but he has the most glorious daughter named Josie, whom I have known for a long time and call my additional daughter. And I'm very offended that she's not on this call since I now know she's home from school. But it is an amazing blessing in my life that I have people I am as close to as these 2 people. And as some others who were on a tribute that took about 25 hours last week, not really true, but Wolfgang was on that too. You're a twofer, Wolfgang, but Jim Mattis and David Rubenstein and Stephen Breyer, the Supreme Court Justice, and ambassadors and this, that, and I mean, it was astounding, and I was just blown away. But let me talk about these 2, and then I will answer your question, but I have to talk about them. I met Wolfgang not at the Munich Security Conference, but when he was the German ambassador to the US. I know something about Germany. My own father grew up in Cologne. He was originally from Poland, and he emigrated to the US. He was fortunate to do that in 1935. I have spent a couple of years in Europe, once as a student and once after law school, and I really care about Europe. But anyway, there was Wolfgang in Washington. And every single meeting I went to that had anything to do about national security, there was Wolfgang. And one day I said, Wolfgang, are you stalking me? And of course not. But what he was doing was, we have very overlapping interests in the topic. We became dear friends then. I was already a regular at the Munich Security Conference. And this year would have been, I think, my 22nd year. And I'm devastated that there is no Jane Harman dinner, just so you know. This is a tradition. It's amazing. I have to pinch myself that it even has some informal name after me. It's a wonderful thing. So next year, maybe we'll have to have 2 of them. Just a thought. But at any rate, I have watched Wolfgang take over the Munich Security Conference and build it from what was a defense boutique, which was very interesting, into this behemoth world national security conference. And I am honored to be on his executive committee and to play a role there. And it also meant a lot to me, Wolfgang, that you spent 10 minutes, well, maybe a month, at the Wilson Center as a scholar. More when I get to my answer to Dan's question. But you mean so much to me, and your family means so much to me, and I can't thank you enough. Now, to my sister, Kathy. I met Kathy when she was the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy at the EU, and we were in Munich. And she is, first of all, brilliant, and I learned so much from her, but second of all, so appealing and personable, and we just became instant friends, and we are still friends, closest friends. And I guess it was my idea that you come to the Wilson Center. I'm not sure if it was, but I think it was. And you chair this program, which Dan directs, and I love it. I love it that you're at the Wilson Center. You stayed a lot longer than Wolfgang has, just making a point. And don't you dare leave, because I will stay affiliated with the Wilson Center, whatever I end up doing next. So I just cannot thank you both enough. And I am delighted to participate with you in this program. And I shouldn't ignore Dan. Dan joined the Wilson Center in August. He's our quarantine baby. After holding a variety of senior positions at the U.S. Department of State, including notably and relevant to this event, Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs responsible for NATO, the OSCE, and transatlantic security issues of the Nordic, Baltic, and Balkan affairs. So I'm turning this back to you, Dan, in 1 second, but I want to answer your question. What should the expectations be? Well, one topic not yet mentioned, but I think it is very much top of mind for people in the US is Russia. And I was there, Wolfgang, I don't know if you were there, Kathy, in 2007, when Vladimir Putin addressed the Munich Security Conference. It was chilling. He had nothing nice to say about the conference or anyone in the room. And he just glared for the duration of his speech. I hope I'm not committing an international faux pas, but that's how I received the speech. And he hasn't been back. And I think that Russia and US-Russian relations are top of mind because Russia was a bad actor during the 4 years of the Trump administration. It was not confronted as a bad actor. And now what are we going to do? And what is Europe going to do beyond what it has done? And in that connection, Wolfgang and I were in the Ukraine in 2015 for the election. I was an election monitor on a delegation with Madeleine Albright, and Wolfgang had escaped the Wilson Center and popped up, setting up roundtables in Ukraine for the OSCE. And he was terrified when he saw me because he thought I might fire him, which I didn't do. But I have to say that he's in such demand that I didn't keep him long at Wilson. But at any rate, Russia is still meddling in the there's Josie. Hello, Josie. Stay here. Stay on this call. You're so grown up now. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Anyway, now, that's so exciting to see you. So Russia is still meddling in the Donbass, and Ukraine still is destabilized by chronic corruption and other things, but also by Russia. So my answer to you, my brief answer, Dan, and I could talk about 28 other things, is that I think as Americans think about Europe, they are thinking about how America and Europe will confront Russian aggression to the West.
Thank you. That relates to some questions we're getting. I'm going to come back to each of you, but that let's just start with the Russia-Ukraine dynamic, because that is a critical issue, and they're related. And the question is, I think, if Wolfgang, on Ukraine, it's it keeps going on, and it's deteriorating. It's a bad situation. We don't seem to be making much progress. The Ukrainians themselves have issues with corruption and everything. We know that, but they also have a major power interfering on their territory. Do you see some prospect for sort of a transatlantic, revival of an approach to Ukraine that will move things forward, or are we stuck? And how do we now address Russia? when there doesn't seem to be necessarily European unity on how to deal with Russia. So let's start with that question, and we can go from there, please. Wolfgang.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a very important question, but let me just preface what I'm going to try to say about the Ukrainian challenge by making a point about the European Union. I'm sure that Kathy, who has, of course, had this key responsibility, will, I'm sure, want to add her views to that. I simply want to say, if, as has been said by our current European leaders, if Europe needs to learn, if the EU needs to learn the language of power, that will probably not happen if Germany does not learn the language of power, namely to use the full toolbox of instruments. It doesn't mean that we should respond to all challenges with military means, but it means that we need to have the toolbox available, from diplomatic niceties through sanctions, including, of course, also military options. And we are, of course, quite frankly, not, we as the European Union, we're not there yet. And this is why basically I think that it is a good thing if we keep hearing from Washington, you in Europe, you need to do more, not really for us in Washington, but for yourselves. Now, on Ukraine, I was not a fan of the original arrangement 6 years ago to handle discussion with Russia, and of course, certainly with Ukraine, in this, what we have now called for the last 6 years, the Normandy format. I was always of the view that it would have been preferable to have the United States participate in this ongoing diplomatic process, which hasn't really gone anywhere so far. So where do we, having made that point, let me just add one additional point. When I listen to Sergei Lavrov or other Russian representatives, I do not see much hope. I have very low expectations about Russian willingness to offer additional compromise solutions in terms of this famous Minsk agreement, implementation of Minsk, etc. I think the conditions in Moscow simply aren't there, or the willingness isn't there. So in the absence of achievable diplomatic progress on Minsk, I think what we, the West, should try to do is to make sure that Ukraine, fighting corruption, privatizing additional areas of economic activity, think of oil and gas, et cetera, that we should help Ukraine become an exhibition of social and economic success. If the folks on the other side of the dividing line in Donbass will find out over time that their neighbors who happen to live, thankfully, on the western side of the dividing line, that they're going to be better off each year, and that their social conditions, their pensions, their salaries, their medical care, their schooling is getting better as we go along. I think that's the kind of process I want to see, because I don't expect Russia to give up easily. But what I would hope is that the population in Donbass would come to understand that it's not really a delightful future they're looking at if they try to continue with these separatist tendencies. That's the best advice I can give. And I had the impression, when I had opportunities to engage with President Zelensky, the current president, and his team, that they've fully understood this. Now, there are enormous obstacles, but I think the United States, and of course, Joe Biden, your new president, he is so eminently qualified. He has been to Ukraine. He knows the issues. He doesn't need to be told where Kiev is or where Crimea is, for example. So we have a wonderful partner now in the White House, and certainly with Tony Blinken and everybody else in the State Department. And I think there is a great opportunity to make a push and to help Ukraine move beyond corruption and move in the direction of increasing prosperity. That's the best recipe I can think of.
Thank you. I'm going to try to weave in now we're getting quite a few questions from people who are with us in the audience. This one is back to our European colleagues, but Jane might have a view on this. And just to preface it, you know, a long time ago, when I lived in West Berlin with the wall around it, at Aspen Institute, we created a little group. We said, who will be the young leaders who will always have their career with the United States or Germany? And let's put those people together and have them meet each other over a number of years. And one of those people, a bright young diplomat, was Wolfgang Ischinger. But another one, an American, was Bill Drosiak, who went on and became foreign editor of the Washington Post, is a well-known author, and he's also a global fellow with us at the Wilson Center. So Bill is on the line here with us, and he asked this question to our European friends, saying, I'm just going to give you the question. He says, I agree that Europe should not wait for the Biden administration to step forward with its plans for a revived transatlantic partnership. But how can Europe unite on key issues that divide its members? There are sharp differences among European states about future strategy toward Russia and China. Macron wants to improve dialogue with Putin, but the Baltic states, Poland, are wary. America wants to maintain strong trading ties with China and not let political issues interfere, but other European states feel very strongly about taking a principled line against human rights abuses. How do you propose to reconcile these types of proposals? Maybe Wolfgang, since I think it was directed to you, but Kathy, based on your comments too, and again, the British relationship now with the continent, those divisions extend across sort of institutional lines. It's not just the EU, it's how the E3 or how the UK now will interact with its European partners on all these issues. Wolfgang, do you have a response to Bill on that, and then Kathy?
Well, you know, as a former practicing diplomat, I have to be an optimist, and I do not believe that the obstacles that would prevent the United States and Europe to see eye to eye, for example, on China and on Russia and others, are insurmountable. I believe this can be done, but we need somebody in Washington who is willing to talk to us and whom we can trust. We didn't really have that for the last 4 years. Let me also admit that, of course, Kathy, I'm sure would agree with me on that. The fact that Brexit has happened doesn't make things easier in the foreign policy area. Let me bluntly say that one of the things I regret most about the current situation is that our relationship, the EU relationship with the United Kingdom in the area of foreign policy, security, I mean, leaving NATO aside for the moment, is about as institutionally underpinned and developed as our relationship with Malaysia or Vietnam or anybody else. In other words, there is really there's a lot of room for improvement, and I would hope that people in Downing Street and in the FCO would reconsider their current position that this is not really desirable. I think we need to find a way to make sure that we will not show up, for example, at the United Nations or at other important crossroads where the European Union does come up with a position, as it happens occasionally. Sometimes we do have a position, all 27, and then the UK comes up with a different position. What impression would that make in Beijing, in Moscow, and elsewhere? So I think we need a coordinating mechanism. But I think that the views which I've read that Europe is on a different track regarding China, that is only partially true. I listened very attentively to when President Biden said that he wants to conduct, or I think that is really what emanated from this, that he was willing to conduct a pragmatic and realistic approach to China. A tough one, yes, and I think we would support him on that. We are very concerned about the human rights violations about Hong Kong. So let's create a coordinating mechanism between us on the European side, including, of course, if we can, the UK and the United States on all these different issues with China, on human rights, on cyber, on strategic and military issues, on trade, on the level playing field when it comes to investment, on artificial intelligence, on 5G and technology issues, extremely important. I'm not so pessimistic about the doability of that. If there is willpower and determination on both sides, and I think there is.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Kathy, do you agree with Wolfgang's optimism here? Or can we find mechanisms to overcome some of these internal European differences?
I think I'm more optimistic even than Wolfgang. First of all, although I think the UK relationship with the EU is challenging right now, without question, there are years and years and years of foreign policy areas of collaboration that have been based on the things that we respect between ourselves. That's human rights, it's values of democracy and ideas. And my point about the three-legged stool is to make the point that we share the same values. That has not changed. So in the context of thinking about these very strategic relationships that require strategic thinking, it will be surprising if at the end of the day there is huge divergence. There will be nuances, of course, but one of my aspirations for the new American administration is it will want to bring Europe, the broader Europe, including Britain, into the family of thinking about what we do, about the relationships of China, and as Jane has rightly said, Russia, and all these broader, bigger considerations that will happen. I chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Union for 5 years. We had 50 formal meetings and 10 informal meetings, as I recall. We never voted, we never failed to find common ground. That didn't mean within the meeting it was all easy. It didn't mean that my chairmanship was so brilliant that it was all fell into place. But it did mean that given the opportunity to sit and think and consider, we were able to find enough common ground in our approach that we could develop plans and ideas and strategy for the future. Now, for me, the biggest thing that needs to happen is, especially on China and especially on Russia, we need that strategic thinking right from the beginning. You know, I was in Kiev last year. It was the last visit I made before lockdown began. And it was really interesting talking to people from different walks of life and different parts of the country, that we are in a position where we don't yet have, and Wolfgang has outlined some of the elements of it, a really thought out plan for where we go and what we do in the future. My analysis of what President Putin, who I sat in a room with many, many times, is that they operate on the principle of a wedge. that if you have within a nation some part of it that is operating differently, that is separated out, that is able to create a wedge into the future development of that country, be it a desire to join the European Union or NATO or anything like that, or simply be it to follow a development model that is distinct and different from the model that Russia might wish, then putting a wedge in does the job in a way relatively cheaply. And we don't have an answer to that. And it's right back to Wolfgang's point about the toolkit, that in our toolkit, we don't really have enough, I think, nuanced elements, from full engagement to total isolation and everything that comes in between. We tend to more and more rely on sanctions as an end rather than a means to an end. And we need to, I think, go back to this strategic thinking of what do we have that we can use to resolve these problems.
Dan, can I add something to that?
Can I just, I was going to turn to you. Let me just, let me add to the question to you, though. In Eastern Europe, the EU has this mechanism called the Eastern Partnership. So 6 Eastern European countries. I would just note that Russian troops are in all of them. They weren't before. So Kathy's point is that what are called so-called frozen conflicts are really, it's a strategy. It's not just, something that happens to be. And my question to Jane, pick obviously whatever you'd like to say, but is the U.S. mood and commitment, is the U.S. really prepared now to re-engage, robustly in that part of Europe, the further east you go, or have we sort of said, it's time for the European or our allies and partners to really take on Eastern Europe more and let us go do things elsewhere? What's your sense of American expectation of itself in terms of U.S. engagement in the eastern realms of Europe?
Okay, well, I thought Kathy's comment about the wedge as a metaphor is really interesting because it's much easier to destabilize than it is to stabilize. And I think that is Vladimir Putin's long suit, is destabilizing, throwing dust up, and assuming that the rest of us are preoccupied or not sufficiently allied with each other anymore and riven by populism and tribal politics, which we are, and that he will get pretty far with that. And he does get pretty far. I want to answer the question about Eastern Europe, but I want to make 2 other points first. Number 1, the European diaspora in the US is huge. I'm part of it. Various country blocks are all over the place, and that affinity will continue forever. I think it's a good reason for optimism, not pessimism. So that would be one. And including Biden's own roots and almost everybody's. Second comment about Biden, and I think you made it, Dan, or maybe Wolfgang did. He's the most experienced foreign policy president we have had since George H.W. Bush, who was president for people not born then, in the very late 80s into 1992 when Bill Clinton was elected. And the presidents since have not had foreign policy chops. And not only has Biden been everywhere, but he also played the senior roles on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And that's baptism by fire, because the Senate over the years has been more partisan, et cetera. So we have somebody, I think, who is a better tool in the toolkit than we've had before. And we also have the most experienced foreign policy team in his administration. And Tony Blinken, our new Secretary of State, grew up in Paris and is, quite European in affect. So, I think all of that argues to be positive. I wanted to make 2 comments. One is about Eastern Europe and one is about Kathy. The OSCE that seconded Wolfgang out of the clutches of the Wilson Center and sent him to Ukraine is an organization, and you know a lot about this too, Dan, that operates by consensus. One of its members is Russia. It's gone through a rough patch. It didn't have a leader for a while this summer. I'm not sure how effective it has rebooted, but it's there. And it is an institution that is supposed to reflect Russia and Europe as a unit, and I'm just curious what others think about how effective it is these days. On Eastern Europe, or I guess I think we've been distracted. I mean, clearly, and we had an administration that didn't think Russia, didn't want to be tough on Russia. So I think that's part of the problem there. The other point I would make, though, is I think and this is something I've heard Kathy make over and over again, in withdrawing from the JCPOA, the Iran deal, we ended the regular consultations among the participants to the deal. And they included, in addition to Europe and us, Russia and China. And Kathy has told me of her regular, as in once a month, consultations, I think that's right, with the Russians and the Chinese, and she got a lot of other business done. So we burned a bridge there that could have been very valuable, especially over the last 4 years, and might have retarded Russian expansionism into Eastern Europe.
Thank you. If I could stay on that point you just raised about the OSCE, we have our next Wilson Center report actually is going to be on the future of the OSCE. It's just, I hope to release it in the next couple of days. You know, we've been working on that issue for a number of months. But there's a very specific, you raised a very specific question going on in the OSCE debate, whether you should not have it as consensus. But you should be able to take decisions maybe -1, that maybe it all doesn't have to move ahead, because the OSCE is not like the EU or NATO, where it's countries of like cause. The OSCE is what I call the organization of uncommon cause. It's countries that don't agree, actually. The only thing they agree to is sit down and try to figure out, manage their differences. And blocked because the consensus rule, but others would say, well, if you don't have consensus among these partners, there's no point in doing it. I just wonder, Wolfgang and Kathy, and you think about the future, does the OSCE have a future? Is this consensus rule something that one should look at, or is that sort of just too in the weeds? The other question that's come up from our audience, when we talk about coming together and all this, it's all very fine. I think we would agree across Atlantic that we all want a more capable Europe. I don't think there's any agreement on that. But there is a term that is used often in EU circles these days, strategic autonomy. Yeah. For Americans, is really kind of hard to understand. We don't know what it means, frankly. Is it mean a more capable Europe, or is it some sort of emancipatory framing? It seems that the Europeans, despite using it, also disagree. I get calls from European colleagues who say, we don't understand it either. So Wolfgang, is that a useful term to help the Europeans, become more capable? Does it kind of get in the way of a more serious discussion?
Well, then this debate about the concept of strategic autonomy reminds me a little bit of a debate we've had, at least in Germany, but I think also in some other EU member countries, about the vision of a quote unquote, European army. We have, strangely enough, in German politics, we have political parties, even in our current coalition, that are not very fond of supporting the military, but they have no problem praising the vision of a European army, which is, of course, probably light years away. But as a vision, I think it's okay. Why should Europe not pursue the vision, even if it may be a very long-term vision of having military capabilities, if I can put it in that way, under one roof and not 27 different militaries, light years away. Same thing with strategic autonomy. We know, Dan, everybody, Kathy knows this better than anyone else, that we are very far from being autonomous, of being capable of running important security and defense initiatives on our own. We lack almost everything that's necessary. We lack transport, we lack surveillance, we lack reconnaissance, we lack satellite capability, we lack literally almost everything. Without the United States, we can't really act. That's truth today, and let's admit it. That is the truth. So, is autonomy anti-American? No, no. If we define the long-term vision of strategic autonomy as enhancing our capacity to act and be a more meaningful partner for the United States, not moving away from the United States, but increasing our capacity to act. Let me add one final thought to this. For the last 4 years, for the Trump years, the debate about the famous 2% goal of NATO, 2% of gross national product for defense, has really been poisoned, has been totally poisoned, speaking of my own country, by the fact that Donald Trump himself, the president of the United States, presented these questions as if we owe him, to pay into, his bank account these 2%. That was a poisonous way of presenting it, because people didn't like him and hated the idea of paying to the United States. Truth of the matter is, this is not about paying the United States. This is about our own security and defense needs, which we should define, and we should do it on our own behalf, for ourselves and for our partners. Very last word. I find it very interesting that many, even of my so-called expert colleagues around Europe, appear not to have ever read Article 42/7 of the Lisbon Treaty, which establishes a very, very intimate mutual assistance relationship, which is at least as robust as the one that we have defined in the NATO, in the Washington Treaty in NATO. So we have a responsibility, also a military responsibility, a responsibility to help our European partners if and when there is ever a kind of a military emergency. Can we actually perform that? Can we do what we are under a treaty obligation vis-a-vis our partners? And this is similar to our NATO debate, but it is not identical. So we need to do it for ourselves, and we need to have this debate. And I hope very much that as Germany goes to the polls later this year in September, that we would have an election campaign in our country that would not only focus on social and unemployment issues, et cetera, but that would include the need to have a strategic foreign policy discussion and to help drive the European Union into the direction over time of strategic autonomy in terms of enhanced capabilities. That's where we should go, with the US, not against.
Kathy, I don't want to lose the point you had made earlier also about Iran, because that is a looming issue of how we have to come back together. And I just wonder if you might also offer any thoughts you have on how we can get that effort going again. Well, one question that's come up in that context from our audience is, wouldn't it be an important gesture of goodwill if President Biden lifted the threat with secondary sanctions on European companies trying to do business with Iran? What would be the frame of a renewed effort with Iran? Is it still just on the nuclear deal, or there are many concerns about Iranian activities beyond its nuclear ambition? Do you have advice that we should be considering? You're on mute, sorry.
I'm conscious that we've only got 4 minutes left, Dan, so let me, OSCE, well, the amazing Helga Schmidt is now at the helm of the OSCE, so it will be fine. That will be my first thing to say. I'm sure Wolfgang agrees with me on that. Secondly, when I was High Representative, one of the reasons that I was engaged with the Western Balkans, apart from the obvious desire to see their European future come closer, was, in a way, I wanted to show the US that the EU was capable of dealing with issues in its own backyard, that it could do things, accepting all that Wolfgang has said about capabilities. What we did have was soft power, EU membership, and a strong collaborative approach from all 27 and 28 countries. So those things are things that I think Europe needs to reflect on, that it can use. And the obvious place to demonstrate what it can do is with America, with the United States, but with European leadership. And I know that the visits this week, which I think are the EU and the US together, looking at Serbia and Kosovo, is really, really important in that context. Iran, well, there's a whole set of questions that I think President Biden and his team will be reflecting on. They are incredibly experienced, not only in the broadest of foreign policy, but these are the people I worked most closely with in the 4.5 years that I was involved with the Iran negotiations. So they know the topic, the issues inside out, and they'll be wanting to look very carefully at what needs to be done. I'm generally in favor of them working out a plan that has different elements to it rather than making gestures. Because the problem is, especially with the hostility in Congress, especially with the hostility in Iran to going back into an agreement with the United States, and of course, with relations with Russia and China not where they were on this subject, never mind the European Union, there's a lot to do. So my broadest sort of principle would be to say they need to be working, as I'm positive they are, quietly and carefully, building with the P5+1, the kind of discussions that will help them begin to think more strategically. But the biggest challenge in a way is whatever the president wants to do, he only has a guaranteed 4 years. And that, I think, needs to be thought about in the context of longer term relationships or deals or agreements, which is something that I know many people feel ought to be at the vanguard of this.
So Jane, in the 1 minute that we have left, last word to you on all of these topics.
Well, I was thinking about that. It's not my last word, all you folks. It's maybe
For
my
this
last
hour,
word
of this hour.
this hour, and maybe in this particular role at the Wilson Center, but I'm totally connected to you folks. And by the way, Wolfgang, if right after this we could chat by phone for a minute, I would welcome that. I'll try to reach you. But my last word is to think about someone who died a week ago at age 100, George Schultz, who everyone agrees held more cabinet offices and was one of the most beloved and experienced diplomats and public servants in American history. And he just wrote a book. Why shouldn't he write a book? He was only 100, on reflections on his life. And he said the most important ingredient in relationships is trust. And we didn't use that word in this conversation, but let's think. The four of us trust each other. Our relationships are long-standing, especially mine with Wolfgang and Kathy. And that automatically means that we will listen to each other and respect each other, even if we disagree. And that is the basis for moving forward in an uncertain world. The world is different. We can't go back to the pre-COVID world. And hopefully everyone will be vaccinated and we'll move forward to a safer world, but it won't be that world. And it may still include masks and distance and quarantines and God knows all the rest of the horrors, but it will include more travel. And by the way, Wolfgang, my last international trip, it was my trip to the Munich Security Conference last year. Of course it was. So I would like to conclude on that the Wilson Center's out there, the Munich Security Conference is too, and all of you are out there building on relationships that can be repurposed or continue to be purposed for a better world. And that trust is baked in. And if we have that, we have the beginning of a better world. So I wanted to be optimistic. I mean, why would I have been in politics for as long as I was if I weren't optimistic? But I want to be optimistic too, especially about the transatlantic relationship, because again, it is so much of the fabric of of both Europe and the US. And I thank you, Dan, for convening this, and my undying love to my brother and sister.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks to Wolfgang and Kathy. I think the history of the relationship has shown, despite agreement, what we didn't disagree on is that we are strategically aligned.
Mhm.
Alignment is the frame in which you carry out your differences. And
Right.
in the last number of years, that basic point was in question. The question is now, can we reestablish that frame? We carry out differences on opinions on various issues. With that in mind, it's not the last word on that, certainly. I encourage everyone to tune in to the Munich Security Conference in a couple days. It's quite a lineup. And we're so proud to have done this with the Munich Security Conference. Wolfgang, thank you and your team. Thank you, Kathy, again, and Jane. It is an event for you, so I do want to say, at least on behalf of our team, thank you for everything you've done for the Wilson Center, and we'll keep this dialogue going. So thanks to everyone for joining. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Take
so
care.
much. Thank you
Thank
very,
you.
very much. Thank you.
Bye.